Okay, if we look at the following quote, which is from a book written by Alice Duncan Kemp, and Alice has written a number of books and about the unique landscape of the Lake Eyre Basin, and they're certainly worth a read. And she's very passionate about the Lake Eyre Basin. And I think one of the issues there, she talks about the strangest and most fascinating regions in Australia. She talks about surrounded by deserts, sand hills, in Gibber country, maze of channels which feed the rivers, and in good season it blooms like a garden, and better than any garden unknown to man or planted by man. And I think that's a really good quote which encapsulates what this Great Basin's about. We've got major basins across Australia, and that's just a quick snapshot of the three major basins which we're interested in. We're interested in obviously the Lake Eyre Basin, we're interested in the Great Artesian Basin, and there's been a lot of discussion today also about the Murray-Darling Basin and some of the, we need to learn from some of the issues that have occurred in that basin. If we look at the actual basin itself, this is the major river systems of the Queensland, Northern Territory and South Australian components of the basin that feed into Lake Eyre, and we're all very familiar with those river systems. We've seen a number of slides about the Channel Country, and it is an amazing landscape, and more importantly, it's an amazing and unique ecosystem that we need to focus on. If we look at maintaining healthy river systems, we've talked a bit about regulation, but the health of the basin's river systems and the adjoining landscapes are really critically dependent on the application of legislation that manages and protects their ecological and cultural values. And the Queensland regulatory framework is both quite comprehensive and it's also robust in managing and maintaining river health. And I'll talk a little bit about the Queensland regulatory framework. We have 10 state acts, and we have a Commonwealth Act that also comes into vogue in terms of legislation. We've got the Water Act, which is about the sustainable management of water and other resources. It's administered by the Department of Natural Resources and Mines, and it applies to everybody except the Coordinator General, who is exempt under the State Development and Public Works Organisation Act. And the Coordinator General can actually access water and manage that process through their projects. We've got the Wild Rivers Act, which is about preservation of the natural values of rivers. And it's got some additional constraints, are activities regulated by the Mineral Resources Act and the Petroleum and Gas Act and the Petroleum Acts. It's administered by the Department of Environment and Heritage Protection. We've got, it also provides a very unique spatial mapping framework where it sets out boundaries in the catchment of where special management provisions apply. We've got the Environmental Protection Act, protection of Queensland's environment, and it manages the environmental impact statement process and the environmental authorities. Again, the Coordinator General can override that particular act, and it's administered by the Department of Environment and Heritage Protection. We've got the State Sustainable Planning Act, which is administered by State Development, Infrastructure and Planning, plus the 73 local authorities across Queensland. And it provides for integrated planning and development assessment of operational works, building works and material changes of use. We've got the Mineral Resources Act, which allows for the assessment, development and utilisation of mineral resources. We've got the Petroleum and Gas Act and the Petroleum Act, which provides for the exploration for recovery and transporting by pipeline petroleum and fuel gas. It also has powers which authorises activity, or authorised activities under that Act is exempt from the Sustainable Planning Act and also local government planning schemes. So it's got some particular powers there. It also conveys water rights on petroleum and gas tenement holders and allows people to interfere and have the unlimited take of groundwater for a petroleum well or an observation bore. And water is called associated water, and it can be used for another purpose, providing there's a water licence under a Water Act. And it can be on-sold, providing it's done through a water service provider. So there's some pretty particular powers there under that particular Act for those tenement holders. Both of those acts are administered by Natural Resources and Mines. We've got the Vegetation Management Act, which is about management of vegetation through remnant through stopping or preventing the clearing of remnant vegetation or managing the clearing of remnant vegetation. And we've got the Land Act, which is about management of non-freehold land and deeds of grant and trust land. And it uses a duty of care obligation. We've got the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act, which is about recognition, providing recognition, protection and conservation of Aboriginal cultural heritage. All of those acts work together, plus the next ones which I'll talk about briefly, the Fisheries Act, which is about the management of the use, development and protection of fish resources and fish habitats, and the Commonwealth Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which is managed by the Minister for the Environment and through the Commonwealth Department. And that act can be triggered if a development proposal has potential impact of national environment significance. For example, something which might impact on the Coongie Lakes Ramsar site. All of the EISs in the Queensland legislation and the environmental authorities for the resources sector are dealt with under the Environmental Protection Act. So you say, right, we've got a complex set of legislation. How is that being used in the basin? Well, in the Windora development in the mid-1990s, triggered the new approach to resource management in the basin. And in 2000, the first water resource plan was introduced, which was the Cooper Creek Water Resource Plan. The Cooper Creek Water Resource Plan has now gone through its 10-year life, and the second generation plan was approved in November 2011. But as well as that, we have Cooper Creek Resource Operations Plan, which is in draft format, anticipated to be approved sometime in June this year. We've got the Georgina Diamantina Water Resource Plan and ROP. We've got the Great Artesian Basin Water Resource Plan and ROP. And we've got the Cooper Creek Wild Rivers Declaration and the Georgina Diamantina Wild Rivers Declaration. All of those instruments are subordinate legislation, which means they are statutory instruments made under an act by an entity other than the Parliament, and they are approved by Governor and Council. And what that means is they've got some pretty good, very strong legal clout in terms of their being enforceable, those statutory instruments. What do these water regulatory instruments contain? Well, Queensland's water planning framework has a two-plan concept. It's got a water resource plan, which is the strategic plan, which is approved by the Minister for Natural Resources and Mines, and we've got a resource operations plan, which is an operational plan, which is approved by the Chief Executive. So you've got the Minister's plan and you've got the Chief Executive plan. These plans detail how existing entitlements will be dealt with. There's a lot of historical entitlements or authorisations you find when you come to do a plan, and it puts them all back on a common platform and puts them back in a consistent and transparent position. It details how streams and overland flow will be managed. There are flow management rules brought in for that. It provides for cultural and environmental flows. So it talks about low flow management, mid-high flow management, drought management, those sorts of things. It allows for reserves of unallocated water for development, and you can either have a state reserve, a general reserve, and we've now got an Indigenous reserve in the Cooper Creek plan. It outlines security of access to water, so it talks about the percentage of years that an entitlement holder can access water, and it applies more to water allocations than what it does to a licence, but it is an important component. Provides detail of water trading if it's in the plan. It talks about the performance of the plan's performance, how that will be monitored and reported, and most importantly, it's a rules-based approach, very strong rules-based approach, and it's underpinned by the best available science that the government can provide. The plans, as I say, they're approved by both the Director-General and the Chief Executive of the Department, and then they're approved by Governor and Council and gazetted. What do those plans contain or provide for? Cooper Creek allows for transferable water licences in the Long-Reach Waterhole Relocation Zone only. So that's the only place where there can be transfer of licences in the Cooper plan. Does not allow for permanent trading of water. Provides a reserve of 2,200 megalitres of water for further development, but that is non-irrigation. There's no irrigation water in there. It's town water supply. It's for industrial, Indigenous and strategic reserve for projects of significance, state significance. It contains upgraded specifications on the existing entitlements. Things like water licences will have a purpose, a rate of take, a daily and annual volumetric limit, maximum storage limit, and pumping thresholds will be specified. The plan allows for 21,662 megalitres of take a year with full activation of those existing authorisations. If you then put the unallocated water in and activate that, it goes up to 23,862 megalitres. In terms of the modelling of that, looking at that with full entitlement, when the flows go through, it's estimated at the Napa Merry gauging station end of system flow that 99.6% of the mean annual flow will pass that station. That's what the modelling tells us. That doesn't guarantee that you're going to get a flow each year. It's when the flows go through, that's what's delivered across the border into South Australia. If we move on to the Georgina Diamantina plan, it allows for existing entitlements to take up 6,108 megalitres for irrigation and town water supply. Of that, 60 megalitres is town water and the remainder is irrigation. All held as water licences. It allows for reserves of unallocated water of 13,000 megs per year for irrigation. For 13,500 for full for irrigation and state reserves. 12,000 for irrigation and 1,500 for state reserves. It does not allow for trading of water licences, and the total take per year full activation is 19,608 megalitres. If we look at the Great Artesian Basin, it provides a reserve of unallocated water of 9,500 megs of general reserve within the Lake Eyre Basin part of the GAB, and 10,000 megalitres of state reserve across the whole Great Artesian Basin. It also has a special allowance to irrigate 10 hectares for fodder crop production and 2 hectares of horticultural crops with GAB water in the Cooper Creek plan area only. If we move on to the Lake Eyre Basin Wild River Decks, that's the, you can see the dark areas there. They're highly sensitive environmental areas, which have been mapped as HPAs and special floodplain management areas. What do those plans contain? The Georgina and Cooper Creek protect hydrological processes, geomorphic processes, riparian function, wildlife corridor function and water quality. They contain spatial areas mapped on maps of the high preservation areas, floodplain management areas, special floodplain management areas, designated urban areas and nominated waterways. And they do provide fairly stringent controls over removal of quarry materials, forest products, take or interference of water in a HPA or SFMA, take of overland flow water in both of those, plus a floodplain management area, works that interfere with overland flow, in-stream works, which Vaughan was talking about earlier today, and also mining. If we look at, they prohibit open cut mining in a HPA and a special floodplain management area, and they require an environmental impact statement for below surface mining in an HPA or SFMA and under a nominated waterway in a preservation area. They prohibit fossicking in a high preservation area or nominated waterway, and they allow for limited petroleum and gas activities in an HPA and SFMA, but they must apply minimum setback distances of 500 metres in an HPA and 200 metres in SFMA from a watercourse, lake or spring, and 100 metres from a nominated waterway. There are some controls over aquaculture, agriculture, animal husbandry and vegetation clearing, and they also list some environmentally relevant activities as well. They do not apply to the existing activities or works at the time the declaration was made. So everything that was existing at that time still allows to proceed. They do not apply to residential, commercial or industrial development in a designated urban area. Now what we see is, how am I going time-wise? Okay? Got about 5. Have I? Slow down, mate, if you're going too fast. No, I'm not. I'm going too slow. The these are some of the floodplain management areas, the large area floodplains that benefit from flooding, from the beneficial flooding we've been talking about today. Why is the resource sector interested in the Lake Eyre Basin? Well, mining tenements cover 42.8% of the land area of the basin. EPs for coal and now cover extensive areas in the basin, particularly in the eastern half. Pre-feasibility studies are underway for 5 major coal mines in the area west of Alpha. And the LEB contains the most significant onshore petroleum resources in Australia. And petroleum tenements cover nearly 77% of the basin. If you look there, the top map is 2000 to 2004. And you look at the bottom, you see the massive expansion in number of tenements in the basin in the last 8 years. The coal seam gas exploration is currently focused in the northern part of the basin. Existing commercial oil and conventional gas production is only in the Eromanga area. The Cooper Geological Basin has been identified as the most productive and commercially viable region for shale gas in Australia. And it's also been identified as having potential for tight gas resources. So if we look at petroleum gas tenements, that's what's happened in the last, since from 2004 to 2012. Huge expansion there. The main deposits in uranium are in the northern sector of the Georgina-Diamantina Basin and in the Gulf of Carpentaria. And the Queensland government's recently announced that a framework for recommencement of uranium mining will be developed. And if we look at the maps there, that shows you increased potential for where the uranium mining deposits are, and it increases the potential for accidents like the Lady Annie mine and the Mount Morgan mine and some of the other mishaps that have occurred. If we look at what the scenario is, potential scenario is, the Minister has announced that he would like to would replace the Lake Eyre Basin Wild River decks with alternative strategies for river protection, and he would give consideration to a potential expansion of small-scale irrigation. What does that mean? The whole of catchment frameworks for regulating activities to protect the natural values of the basin would no longer be in place. Any regulation of development activities could only occur through those 3 acts, and those acts are both piecemeal and potentially ineffective. The high impact activities such as mining and petroleum gas extraction would be no longer prohibited or regulated in those areas close to the rivers. Interfering with overland flows and floodplains would not be regulated. Prohibition of in-stream dams and weirs would not be included in any regulation of those areas around the major rivers and channel country. New cropping developments would be no longer excluded. Riverine protection permits would not be subjected to provisions of the Wild Rivers Code. The development of small-scale feedlots under the ERA threshold would no longer be prohibited. Amendments to the Cooper Creek Water Resource Plan and ROC would be necessary to free up water in the Cooper Creek Plan area. Some proponents for an expansion of irrigation made the expectation that they would get that water at no cost. That would be contrary to government policy. The trading rules, if water trading was introduced, the trading rules would require the Department of Natural Resources and Mines to upgrade their IQQM model for the Cooper and build a model for the Georgina-Diamantina to test what the impacts of those particular trades might be. It's accepted that the most common showstoppers for resource projects in the remote parts of the state are those 4 components. I will pick up on one, security of access to economically extract the resource, and to access to secure and reliable water supply. If we look at the Lake Eyre Basin catchments, they're not allowed to do open cut in the HPA and special floodplain management areas. So that stops open cut mining, and it means that they have to look at some other way of accessing the resource. Hence the strong push from the resource sector to get rid of Wild River declarations. The existing basin plan directly manages public access to secure and reliable water supply. And if they are looking for that, the options they've got are extracting water from the Great Artesian Basin, extracting surface water through a pipeline from a storage like Fairburn Dam, which is a hell of a long way away, extracting water from streams in the basin.
Just starting to come over.
Are you? I've got about 3 to go, mate.
All right, go.
Or clean up extraction of coal seam gas water. And the two likely and most attractive options to the mining industry would be Great Artesian Basin water and coal seam gas water. I think we need to keep that in mind. The limited quantities of strategic reserve in the basin could push the government to the government to look at amending the water plans to put larger quantities of reserve water in them, or they could look at giving greater access to GAB and coal seam gas water. And I think the interesting thing is that the survey there of members, both through RAP members and also the AgForce survey, identified a whole heap of values and resources which needed to be protected, which are already being protected by the legislative or regulatory frameworks I've been talking about. And therefore, I've quizzed a bit why we're trying to take those out. We'll duck on to just, I need to do the wrap-up messages then.
I think it'd be a good idea, Tom.
Rightio.
I'll come over and cover.
Will you? I don't want you to do that, Adam. Okay, I've unfortunately run out of time, but I'll give you some potential solutions. Could be replacing the Wild Rivers Act with a Natural Rivers Management Act, which, I mean, these rivers are not wild out here, we all agree that, but it's a different way, and putting in that act protection for the HPA and the SFMA. I think you can do away with the protection for preserved areas, preservation areas. We don't need to die in the ditch there on that one, but certainly in those two areas, pretty important. The could also look at doing some amendments to the basin's water plans to free up that water and allow some trading. But I talked about the need for better models for that before we went down that track, and I would suggest that no further reserves of water goes in there until such time as all of the existing large sleeper licences and reserves of unallocated water are taken up. There's 28,000 megalitres of water available in the system now for irrigation. If people are able to trade those licences or take up the unallocated water, why do we need to do any more? So my take-home message is we need to focus on the big picture, which is about the resource industry, because irrigation in some ways is a bit of a smokescreen, folks. The big issue of impact in this basin is potentially expansion of the resource industry in an uncontrolled fashion. If there is any increase in small irrigation, it is small scale, and we need to just keep it at that, although I'll talk about that later on when somebody's going to ask me a question I understand. And I think I'll leave it at that. Just it's about tweaking things rather than whole-scale change. But I do suggest that perhaps that Natural Rivers Management Act is potentially a way to go. Thank you.